Hello, 1302. This is C-Rob. I wanted to give you a quick primer on Langston Hughes. Don't tell anyone, but they work us pretty hard here. So I have about 20 minutes, September and October, to do this. So hopefully I'm on point. My memory's there, Langston Hughes. But I wanted to go over Langston Hughes' bio and theme sheet and the questions that are on Blackboard in Module 2, but I'm going to go pretty quickly. Langston Hughes was born in Missouri to an upper middle class family. I think there were a lot of politicians, ministers. He went to Columbia University in New York in the 20s, and there were precious few African Americans that went to Columbia Ivy League school in the 1920s. He stayed for a year, and then he went to Paris. He worked in a jazz club as a waiter, but he hung out with a lot of musicians, artists, writers. The 1920s may have been one of the better times to be African American, like in our Western culture. So then he came back in the 20s to Harlem. Most of the writers, musicians, thinkers moved to Harlem. It was called the Harlem Renaissance, and you might want to Wikipedia that. But anyone who could, certainly anyone that was a writer or an artist or a musician that was African American, moved to Harlem in the 1920s. My note says that Hughes was the best first-person account of the age, what it was like to be African American, upper middle class in the 1920s. He won many awards. My note says he was a Harlem everyman. So most everyone in the country knew who Langston Hughes was, knew his poetry. And he won many awards. He became a little grumpier in his old age. He was a socialist. Maybe as we read his poetry, we'll compare the optimism of a young Langston Hughes in the 20s to the pessimism of Langston Hughes in the 50s and 60s. But ultimately, for about 40 years in our culture, he was the most famous African-American writer. His style, I talked about, my note says impact of Harlem Renaissance. So again, like in the 1920s, roaring 20s, people were drinking after Prohibition, having a good time. It was kind of hip to be African-American, to go to a blues club, to go hear an African-American writer read his poetry. White people were sort of pretending that they were black. So it was a hip time to be alive in America. Low art and eroticism. A lot of his poetry, or maybe African-American poetry and music, blues of the time, had to do with sex. And maybe rich white people didn't write poetry or sing songs about having sex. So his poetry was kind of labeled as low art. Art saves the race idea. Again, 1920s. Rich white people kind of wanted to be black. They wanted to experience African-American life. So the art, the music, the culture made white people interested in black people in the 1920s. Hughes was realistic. I wrote black is beautiful and ugly. He tried to get away from the stereotypes, what daily life was like in a city for an African American. And maybe that meant pounding the pavement looking for a job. Maybe that meant going to a blues club and hanging out with the musicians and being cool. But all facets of life. I wrote plight of black middle class in the 30s and 40s. Sometimes in my lectures, I'll talk about Jay-Z and Beyonce. Like wherever Jay-Z grew up in New York City, he's a billionaire now, owns, dozens of companies. Where does he send his children to school? Where does he go to church? Where does he shop? And seemingly, Jay-Z and Beyonce would shop at high-end stores, really expensive stuff. And it begs the question, from Jay-Z to like our athletes today, maybe back to the 1920s, if you make it, if you're African-American and rich and successful, where do you hang out? Where's your house? Do you build your house in the old neighborhood? Do you send your kids to the neighborhood school? You go to the same church, or do you go to like the rich people church? Maybe you read that as the rich white people church, but it's sort of the concept, if you made it, if you're successful, selling out. Like rich white people want your music, they want your poetry. Yeah, I think you get the point. So impact of white mainstream on the African-American consciousness. Number 8 says jazz and blues. It's comparable to hip-hop today. We might talk a bit in class about hip-hop, but the impact of music on white culture, like suburban mall kids acting like they were rappers and what that means. Is that a good thing? Racism and hypocrisy. Maybe even tracing back to the days of slavery. How can you go to church and espouse those principles, be good to everyone, help your neighbor, but own slaves, and then 50 years later, discriminate, be prejudiced, be racist against black people if you're a good Christian? Urban life. After slavery, maybe around 1900, 1920, a lot of African Americans moved from the South to larger cities, Detroit, St. Louis, New York City. So you get away from slavery in the South, you move to a big city where you can do what you like. Famous works. One of my favorite of his poems is called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. My old school in Iowa was in Clinton, and we could look at my classroom. You could look out the window and see the Mississippi River. And The Negro Speaks of Rivers is about the Mississippi River. So I would have my students look out the window at the river. And I don't know if you've ever seen the Mississippi, but it's not crystal clear and blue. It's kind of dark and muddy. But Langston Hughes finds strength in that river. He says the Mississippi River has seen the Revolutionary War. It's seen slavery. It's seen the very best and worst of America. And it keeps on flowing. It endures. And there's also a point about the color of the mud. Like maybe when Langston Hughes was alive and writing, the most beautiful woman in the world was Marilyn Monroe. Blonde hair, blue eyes. But the poem suggests that through the years, maybe the most beautiful woman in the world would have a like brown skin tone. Like Beyonce, I have a little red in my skin. I try to have a nice tan. But I think one of his bigger points, Mississippi River endures, and like the color is all of us together. So hundreds of years of white people and black people, brown people, yellow people all together, kind of like the America as a stew. We all mix together and we come out brown like the river. The Weary Blues is about blues, sort of the suffering of African Americans, what they have to go through every day. Get up, be happy, try to find a job, get a job, but keep fighting. And there's some hints of suicide there too. So the blues is African-American life in America in the 30s. Harlem might be his most famous poem. It's also called Dream Deferred. It's a really short poem, a lot of images of rotting meat, but all the rage that African-Americans have felt, 100, 200 years in America, at the end, it begs the question, does it turn to violence? They explode angry, or does it wither and die? So if you're African-American, you've suffered, your mother, your grandfather suffered for hundreds of years. Do you blow up with anger, or do you deal with it, suck it up, but be sad and frustrated? A lot of these things connect to Black Lives Matter movement now, and we'll talk about that. And let's see. The Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain is a short story. It's the plight of the African-American middle class. Hughes says he wants to be a poet, not an African-American poet, just a poet. So the mountain is racial issues. A little bit the example I gave before about Jay-Z and Beyonce. If you're a rich African American, how do you live your life? How do you deal with poor African Americans? Do you move toward rich people in the city? You get away from where you grew up. Do you become a doctor, a lawyer, a politician? Do you try to stay away from the old neighborhood? And maybe the old neighborhood has drugs or sex or drinking or violence or whatever you want to say. Do you move as far away from where the violence and poverty is? What I said before about, do you send your kids to rich schools where you go to restaurants? What kind of clothes do you wear? Stuff like that. White mainstream consumes black culture. Harlem is hip for white people. So again, the nature of the Harlem Renaissance. A big question, if you're Langston Hughes or like a blues musician, generally, if it's 1925, the white people have all the money. Do you write for white people, like, using them to explain the plight of black people? You need their money, you need the publishing. In your writing, do you ultimately write for the rich white people, or do you write for your community? Maybe you don't get published, maybe not as many people read it, but we'll talk about that, and that's a big concept in African-American literature, who you're writing for. That it also connects very much to Harriet Jacobs, and we'll talk about that. But Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain is really about selling out for mainstream money. And then quickly, the Langston Hughes questions. Harlem, the image is rotting meat. African Americans, years and years of being beaten down. Do you explode with anger? Do you loot, break stuff? Or do you just suck it up and deal with it? You're frustrated, you're sad, you wither away. So it's hints at potential violence. Langston Hughes' purpose in writing is to illuminate the African-American condition in America. How do the poems in our collection illustrate his attempt? So that's pretty broad. You would pick 2 or 3 poems and talk about how it shows 1920s, what life is like for an African-American. What's the message of the Negro Speaks of Rivers? Quick and dirty, I told you this before, the river keeps flowing. It's seen America at its best and its worst. African Americans keep going. And there's this thing about the skin pigmentation, that you put us all in the room, black people and white people, hundreds of years, we work it out. I might be talking dirty, but that's about as far as I'm going to go. Blues and the poetry of Langston Hughes. Kind of the blues are sad weariness of African Americans. So you go listen to the blues, you go listen to a sad song, and it makes you feel better because you're sad too. I Too America is a shorter poem. Black people having to eat in the kitchen, not at the main table with the white people. And ultimately, Langston Hughes is saying, I'm here too. America, African Americans are here too. We got to eat. We go to the bathroom. We're here too. I added that we got to go to the bathroom part. Pick one of Hughes's poems and discuss how it raises issues of social justice. That could connect to a life in 2020, Black Lives Matter, pandemic, whatever you want to call it. But pick 3 of his poems or 2 of his poems that connect to what life is like now. How does Hughes depict the Harlem Renaissance in his writing? Again, Hughes was fairly well-to-do. He was wealthy. So Harlem Renaissance, the white people wanted to be like him. They wanted to be hip. It kind of goes back to selling out. Who are you writing for? You writing for the mainstream to get paid, or you're writing for your neighborhood? And then it kind of connects to number 8, African-American middle class and Hughes poetry. So you make it, you're a success, you're a writer, you're a musician, you live in Harlem, you make lots of money, it's 1925. How do you deal with the poor people in the old neighborhood? Okay, that's kind of quick and dirty. Langston Hughes, as quick as I could do it. Okay, bye, 1302.